To comprehend the profound implications of the recent confrontation between the United States and Canada, one must look past the political theater of podiums and press conferences. The true narrative unfolds not in the sound bites of diplomats, but in the silent subterranean realities of geology and global supply chains. While headlines screamed of trade wars, aggressive rhetoric, and punitive tariffs emanating from the Trump administration, these were merely the surface disturbances of a deeper, more significant seismic shift. The real story was written in the immediate violent reaction of commodity markets and in the unforgiving arithmetic of dependency. This episode was not a demonstration of American leverage, but a stark revelation of its profound vulnerability, a self-inflicted wound that laid bare the perils of substituting political bluster for economic strategy. I'm John Stewart. I supposedly teach public policy at Berkeley, where I try to understand how economics, power, and the whole messy project of democracy tango together, usually stepping on each other's feet. And looking at this Potash thing, this isn't a trade negotiation. This is a critical case study in what happens when performative politics smashes headfirst into the immutable laws of reality. We're going to unpack the mechanics of this little disaster. We're going to identify the winners and losers. Spoiler alert, the losers are us. And we're going to see how deep structural forces, the kind you can't tweet away, utterly humiliate superficial political posturing. The administration's threat to impose tariffs on Canadian potash was not an act of economic coercion. It was an act of economic self-sabotage. In targeting this critical import, the United States was not aiming a weapon at the Canadian economy. It was, with startling incompetence, pointing that weapon directly at the heart of its own agricultural sector and, by inevitable extension, at every American consumer. This move exposed a dangerous ignorance of a basic principle. In trade, you cannot sever a vital artery and expect only the other body to bleed. To grasp the sheer scale of this miscalculation, we must first understand the unique and non-negotiable role of the resource at the center of this storm. Potash is not a luxury good, a discretionary consumer item, or a piece of technology that can be innovated around on a whim. It is a common name for various potassium-bearing minerals and compounds, and potassium is one of the three primary macronutrients, alongside nitrogen and phosphorus, essential for all plant life. It is a biological imperative. Potassium regulates photosynthesis, activates enzyme systems, controls water uptake, and is crucial for protein synthesis and disease resistance. Without adequate potash, crop yields plummet, plants become susceptible to pests and drought, and the quality of fruits, grains, and vegetables deteriorates. Therefore, potash is not merely an agricultural input, it is the lifeblood of modern, high-yield agriculture. It is the foundation upon which the entire edifice of our food system is built. The green revolution of the 20th century, which allowed humanity to feed a booming population, was fueled as much by synthetic fertilizers, like potash, as by new seed varieties. This dependency is absolute and inelastic. A farmer cannot decide to use half the potash this year because the price is high, any more than a human can decide to breathe half the air. The choice is binary: pay the market price or face catastrophic crop failure. Now, consider the source of this vital resource for the United States. American agriculture is nearly wholly dependent on imports for its potash supply, and of those imports, a staggering 90% come from a single source: Canada. Let this figure resonate. 90%. This is not a diversified supply chain with multiple alternative suppliers across the globe. This is a state of near total monolithic dependency. The majority of this supply flows from the vast, high-quality deposits in the province of Saskatchewan, home to some of the largest and most economically viable potash mines on the planet. So, when the threat emerged to tax this import, it was not merely a tariff on a commodity, it was a direct threat to the foundational input of the American breadbasket. The markets, which operate on cold, rational calculus devoid of political sentiment, understood this instantly. They did not wait for legislation to be drafted, debated, or passed. The moment the presidential rhetoric hit the airwaves, potash prices on futures markets surged. This was the hidden, real-time verdict that most political commentary missed. While pundits debated optics and leverage, the market was already pricing in a disaster, a risk premium for the sudden instability injected into a critical, rigid supply chain. This fear-based surge was a direct, measurable cost imposed not on Canada, but on the American farmer in Iowa, the almond grower in California, and the wheat producer in Kansas, who were suddenly confronting a catastrophic spike in their single most unavoidable operating cost. This was, in every sense, an economic own goal of spectacular proportions. It forces a critical question. Why would a political administration deliberately target a supply line so utterly critical to its own domestic stability and food security? The answer lies in a profound and pervasive misunderstanding of structural power in the modern global economy. The prevailing mindset in certain political circles operates on a simplistic, zero-sum model of power. The loudest voice, the strongest threat wins. It is a worldview that believes political rhetoric and will can override physical, logistical, and geological reality. It treats international trade as a real estate negotiation or a street brawl. This episode demonstrated the fatal flaw in that logic. Canada controls the largest, highest-grade potash reserves in the world. This is not a policy choice or a temporary market condition. It is a geological fact. The potassium-rich salts were deposited in an ancient inland sea millions of years ago, and the largest and most accessible of these deposits lie under the Canadian prairies. The United States possesses only limited, lower-grade deposits. No amount of political posturing, nationalist fervor, or campaign promise can legislate a world-class mineral deposit into existence within U.S. borders. What we witnessed, therefore, was a dramatic collision between the illusion of political authority and the immovable wall of economic and geological reality. On the surface, the performance was one of toughness and unilateral action. Beneath the surface, the United States was exposing its own jugular, demonstrating to the world and to the markets that its most vital supply chains are terrifyingly fragile and subject to the whims of political incompetence. This is a textbook example of what occurs when economic policy is driven by performative conflict rather than by a careful analytic understanding of integrated supply chains and mutual dependency. We are seeing the dangerous consequences of treating deep symbiotic trade relationships as zero-sum games, where for one nation to win, the other must lose. Within the deeply integrated North American economy, a system meticulously constructed over decades to enhance efficiency, stability, and mutual prosperity, this kind of thinking is not just counterproductive, it is economically suicidal. You cannot blow up the bridge you are standing on and expect only the other side to fall into the ravine. The immediate economic injury to the United States was entirely self-inflicted, an attack on American productive capacity orchestrated by the American government, all under the banner of protecting American interests. The irony is devastating. The invisible hand of the market is often discussed, but here we witness the very visible fist of political ineptitude smashing the very apparatus it claimed to defend. The Canadian response was instructive in its quiet confidence. Canada did not need to engage in public counter-threats, dramatic speeches, or retaliatory rhetoric. Canadian officials and industry executives simply waited. They understood a fundamental truth that the American administration apparently did not. In the specific sector of potash, the United States needs Canada far more than Canada needs the United States. This is structural leverage in its purest form. It is quiet, immovable, and devastatingly powerful. While the U.S. was manufacturing chaos and inadvertently driving up costs for its own citizens, Canada was calmly preparing precise, legal, and effective countermeasures within established trade frameworks, all while solidifying its other global trade relationships. The leverage of controlling an essential resource they knew permanently outweighs the transient noise of political bluster. This potash episode is not an isolated incident. It is a stark microcosm of a larger, systemic failure in modern economic strategy. We have entered an era where the nuanced art of economic statecraft, the use of economic tools to achieve strategic goals within a rules-based framework, is being replaced by the crude tactic of economic bullying. But bullying is only an effective strategy when the bully genuinely holds overwhelming power and the target has no recourse. In the arena of critical raw materials and essential resources, the power asymmetrically lies with the producer, not the consumer. By threatening Canada, the U.S. administration did not showcase strength. It advertised a glaring lack of basic economic literacy. It signaled to allies and adversaries alike that it does not understand the fragility of its own foundational supply chains. For an advanced economy, such volatility is poison. Farmers cannot make multi-year planting and investment decisions when input costs can double overnight due to a political tantrum. Agribusinesses cannot plan capital expenditures when the rules of cross-border trade are subject to capricious revision. The long-term stability required for sustainable economic growth was sacrificed at the altar of a 24-hour news cycle. This chaos, however, is not without its beneficiaries. It is crucial to dig into who profits from this instability, because it is certainly not the average American family facing higher grocery bills as farming costs rise. It is not the rural communities whose prosperity is tethered to a stable agricultural sector. The winners in such scenarios are often found in the speculative shadows of the financial markets. The official story presented to the public was one of national pride and rectifying unfairness. The narrative claimed that Canada was taking advantage of the US and that tariffs were a negotiating tool to force concessions on other issues such as dairy or automotive trade. This framework assumes all commodities and trading relationships are interchangeable, and that pressure on one point will cause wholesale capitulation on others. In the case of potash, this narrative was not just incomplete, it was dangerously deceptive. The reality of the potash market is one of oligopoly and inelastic demand. A handful of major players, with Canadian firms at the forefront, control the vast majority of the global supply. When the threat of a tariff, a supply disruption, was introduced, the market reacted with a panic spike. But who actually paid this new higher price? The cost did not land on the Canadian mining companies. As monopoly suppliers of an essential good, they were in a position to pass on any potential tariff cost entirely or even benefit from the higher global price anxiety created. The uncertainty premium was baked directly into the price paid at the farm gate in the United States. This triggered a perverse wealth transfer. The immediate winners were speculators and commodities traders who thrive on volatility. Stable, predictable prices are the enemy of speculative profit. A government-announced crisis is a windfall, allowing traders to buy futures contracts on the fear and sell into the panic, extracting millions from the system while producing nothing. The ultimate victim was the American farmer. Modern farming operates on razor-thin margins, fueled by significant debt to cover upfront costs for seed, fuel, and fertilizer. A sudden 20–30% increase in the cost of potash cannot be absorbed. It is an existential threat. Furthermore, farmers cannot pass this cost to the next link in the chain because the price they receive for their corn, soy, or wheat is set by global commodity exchanges, not by their individual cost of production. They are price takers, not price makers. This dynamic facilitated a direct transfer of wealth from the productive economy of the American heartland to the speculative ledgers of financial intermediaries. This incident lays bare the mechanics of modern protectionist rhetoric, which often achieves the precise opposite of its stated goal. Rather than protecting domestic industry, it exposes it to predatory price shocks and drains capital from productive communities. The policy, intended to discipline a foreign supplier, instead disciplined the very citizens it purported to defend. The damage was inflicted before a single tariff was ever collected. The threat alone was sufficient to disrupt the market and punish the domestic economy. In today's world, a government's credibility and its commitment to stability are economic assets as valuable as currency reserves. When a government squanders that credibility by acting irrationally, it imposes a risk premium on every transaction within its economy. Businesses must hedge against sudden, arbitrary policy shifts, and that cost of insurance is ultimately paid by the consumer. To understand why this cycle persists, one must examine the disconnect between the political narrative of self-sufficiency and the undeniable reality of global interdependence. We are often sold a myth of national economic sovereignty, the idea that a large nation can stand alone. The potash crisis proved in a matter of hours that it cannot. Our systems are inextricably linked. Borders can slow the movement of goods, but they are porous to price signals. When you slap a tariff on a critical import, you are not punishing a foreign producer. You are taxing your own population and undermining your own economic foundations. The background context of North American integration is crucial here. For decades, the US, Canadian, and Mexican economies have been woven together to create a seamless, efficient, and competitive continental bloc. This integration was a deliberate strategic project to lower costs, enhance security, and increase collective prosperity. American farmers benefited enormously from this arrangement, enjoying reliable, just-in-time delivery of high-quality fertilizer via an efficient rail network from a stable, friendly neighbor. This kept their input costs lower than if they depended on shipments from geopolitically uncertain regions like Russia or Belarus. Threatening to disrupt this integration was an attack on America's own structural advantage. It was an attempt to break a system that was designed and functioned brilliantly to make American industry more competitive. The episode also carries a profound geopolitical dimension. The United States spent the latter half of the 20th century building and championing a global order based on rules, treaties, and multilateral institutions. Trade agreements like the USMCA and the WTO were meant to provide a predictable framework for resolving disputes without resorting to economic warfare. When the leading architect and beneficiary of that system deliberately ignores its own rules and reverts to raw coercion, it undermines the entire structure. It signals to every other nation that agreements are worthless and that only brute force matters. However, as the Potash case proved, force is relative. You may possess the world's largest military and economy, but if you lack the potassium, you remain vulnerable. Canada demonstrated that structural power, the control over essential resources, is often more durable and decisive than transient political power based on bluster. In the end, the market itself delivered the verdict. Capitalism, far from being a simple free market, is a complex system of power relations. The relationship between a monopoly supplier of a necessity and a dependent buyer is not one of equals. It is one of structural dependency. The US administration tried to perform a drama of dominance, pretending this dependency did not exist. It acted as if the United States could simply dictate terms to reality itself. But reality does not negotiate. The Potash crisis was a harsh, expensive lesson in the limits of political will. You cannot bully a supply chain you do not control. While the headlines have inevitably moved on to the next controversy, the structural vulnerability exposed by this event remains unchanged. The United States is still dependent. It is still vulnerable. And as long as political leadership ignores the basic mechanics of the resources upon which the nation's prosperity and security rest, the public will continue to pay the price for that ignorance. This is not merely a story about fertilizer. It is a foundational story about the hubris of power, the unforgiving nature of economic and geological gravity, and the timeless question that must be asked of any policy: who benefits and who pays? In this case, the answers were clear. Speculators benefited, while American farmers and consumers paid. The true cost was measured not in tariffs collected, but in stability lost, trust eroded, and wealth extracted from the very communities that the policy was theatrically designed to protect.